Of you may have heard. Great.
Sorry, Keith, I meant to turn that on at the beginning of your slides. Turning it on a bit late.
No worries. So for everybody, just noting, sometimes many of you will have heard the term concessionary capital. And so sometimes this is actually where we're doing a bit of a reframe on concessionary capital. And actually saying that it can be catalytic because sometimes we can pick different risk return and impact profiles in order to draw in more capital. Um, and so just noting that capital is sorry for the typo, but is also an essential component of the broader domains of impact investing, and it's a tool used in blended finance. So I think now you start to see how we're stacking these together. Um, and then last but not least, a term that has been emerging in the Canadian context most recently, though it has been certainly in use for quite a while in other global contexts, and that is systemic investing. And I'm actually taking this definition from Wayne Miranda, Definity Foundation. He actually put out a great LinkedIn post recently that actually draws this out a little bit more. And so the term, as defined by Wayne, is systemic investing is a multi-stakeholder polycapital ecosystem approach. So for everybody, wow, your friends at the next cocktail party with that quote. And as a part of that, what I will note is always good to make sure that we're not accidentally layering in confusion. So polycapital, for everybody, just in case, that's a new term to you. Polycapital refers to approach which is a strategic combination of financial capital with non-financial elements like human, social, intellectual, and ecological capital to create broader value. So just noting that that is the case. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to just create a bit of separation between, impact investing as a whole. We have this term that's blended finance. We have this term, which is a tool, catalytic capital, within the bounds of blended finance. Um, and then often when we are all engaging in blended finance structures, there is oftentimes a desire to create systemic change with those individual deals and an accumulation of those deals. And that's why I want to surface this topic of systemic investing, because often when we are contributing to organizations, and I think about some of the foundations in the room, often you're not just providing what we will call impact investment capital, but also maybe capacity, like technical capacity building dollars in grant form and other means. And that's really where you can start to see systemic investing start to happen, both emanating from an individual organization and then, of course, spanning across the ecosystem as a whole. So this, I hope, is going to be the one and only time that we go lecture style within this 7 weeks. But I always, I think, important for us to get ourselves grounded in a set of definitions. So I'm going to dig deeper now on blended finance, but before I do want to pause here just in case there was any questions on the definitions that I raised, or if you want to raise, for example, how you might have been thinking of any of those terms in an alternative through an alternative lens. So I'll just pause here just in case there are any questions or comments, and then if not, I can continue. Yeah, amazing. Don't hesitate to ponder and come back with questions and thoughts as we go through. And we'll continue to dig in on this particular conversation. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to dig a bit deeper into blended finance itself. So, just regrounding, again, blended finance is a strategy that combines capital with different levels of risk in order to catalyze risk-adjusted market rate seeking finance into impact investing. To paraphrase, there is an opportunity for us as impact investors to take different approaches to attract more market rate capital into deals. And if we do so, we're attracting more market rate investors into the world of impact investing. And we use blended finance structures as a vehicle to do that. It is important to note that that does not mean that we must, be the catalytic capital or the concessionary capital or the people who are taking different levels of return. In our own construct, there will be times where we might take a higher level of return according to the balance of risk, return, and impact. And so, but overall, the benefit that we have is we have this potential to bring together different components to attract new money in. We're trying to grow the pool of impact investing in Canada and ultimately the world. That's what this refers to. And so just to dig a little bit deeper in on this, um, as we talk through this, we're trying to also bring in more diverse pools of capital. And so one example, so a couple of you were at the Blended Finance Summit at the beginning of March in Toronto. And what was fascinating is this was the first year that we had both CIBC and BDC, or the Business Development Bank of Canada, in attendance. And so this is a scenario where these organizations are starting to say, hey, like for example, in the case of CIBC, they are a chartered bank. There are certain things they can and cannot do accordingly. However, by participating in this, there's an opportunity to bring some of that capital to bear on some of these very specific and systemic impact investing opportunities that exist within the Canadian context by using blended finance. I will give everybody a quick example here so that you can kind of see that come to life. So some of you may have heard of and/or have heard them speak, which is Grocer. Grocer is an Ontario-based organization that is trying to really catalyze the urban agriculture ecosystem in Canada. They're trying to eliminate food deserts, and they're trying to increase access to healthy and fresh food. And as a part of that, they struggled with something interesting in that the demand was there across communities in Canada, especially small and remote communities and in Indigenous communities. However, their ability to pay for the solutions was limited. So what Grocer has done is they have launched a fund, and it's a loan fund designed to support the acquisition of urban agriculture solutions. Um, and in their particular case, what they have done is they have combined two major sources of capital. So one is they actually partnered with Ottawa Community Foundation to create a DAF. And the premise there is that for those individuals, family offices, and foundations that believe in the mission of Grocer, they can actually donate into the DAF, and then the DAF invests into the Grocer fund. And so that's catalytic capital that is moving into a blended finance vehicle. And the reason I call it a blended finance vehicle is because on the other side of that DAF is the Royal Bank of Canada. So Royal Bank, in at least there's a specific department in Royal Bank who works in food systems. And so they said, hey, we can bring loan capital to the fund and so invest in the fund with their own loan capital, but they would have to do it within a certain set of parameters around market rate. So by combining the DAF and RBC's capital, A, they were to raise funds sufficient to support the ecosystem, but also the combined rate of return actually makes it very affordable for the communities that require it. So it's a really kind of just a bringing that notion of like of how do we bring some mainstream capital that would otherwise not come to the table. This is how we do it. And thus, for example, why CIBC came to the summit is to learn how they could do it and deploy some of their, frankly, very large capital pools into this ecosystem. So that's a real life example. Maybe I'll just quickly pause here if there's any questions on that example or what we said so far. So far, so good. Great. Thank you. I will note here, blended finance absolutely can include public money as well as private and philanthropic sources. So there are absolutely situations where there are public money, including federal, provincial, and/or municipal governments have an opportunity to participate. As you dig more into blended finance, you will also see, for example, fantastic examples of public money participation in the UK context. But it is not required. And so I think that's very important in our Canadian context is in we don't have to wait for a branch of government to come to the table to effect a deal. And so we're definitely seeing more and more of that activity. What I will note to everybody is one of the participants in this program who could not make it today, but will be here next week, is with one of Canada's largest credit unions. And so another example where a financial institution is also a part of this capital stack. Great. Um, so um, the other key and final point that I really want to make on this is that impact investing is an investment approach, whereas blended finance is a structuring approach. Blended finance is a way for us to take our impact investing thesis, to take our theory of change and bring it to life and use specific vehicles. And so my encouragement here for everybody is this actually should be where all of us get a lot of energy and excitement and optimism. And the reason I say that is because um, they're actually across not only the Canadian ecosystem, but also other ecosystems in the world. There's now quite a few case studies and examples and templates of these structures. So very often, I would say most often, most of us don't have to create something from scratch. It's probably been done before, and we can use those original examples and case studies either verbatim and or as guides to then create something that works. So just wanted to cover that off. I feel like this is kind of the end of my terms, terminology, definitions section. Any questions? Everybody's ready to go on Jeopardy and take this column on. Ryan, over to you.
Definitely not ready for Jeopardy. But the answer is, what is the global landscape? I'm curious. You said there's a lot of blueprints. Have you seen international blueprints work in Canada? Or is it just a concept that we might be able to duplicate here?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the extreme, Ryan, um, concepts have proven to be highly portable. And so we have seen concepts from the UK, from the US, from LATAM. I can also think of a couple of concepts that came from South and Southeast Asia that actually have been able to port into the Canadian context. Now, to your point, that's obviously where the first, any regulatory requirements, regulatory restrictions, applying it in the Canadian legal context, of course, that. I think the greater um, cause for for some of these concepts to port quickly over to the Canadian context is often we as investors, when something is new to us, we need to really wrap our heads around it. And so what I would suggest is some of the examples that exist in the global context have been slow to come to Canada because of the change management required, both with the investor as well as the investee around this. Um, and I actually will have an example coming up shortly that will talk about some of this. So certain things like, loan guarantee, first loss capital, things like that have actually come into Canada reasonably seamlessly. But there are other ones that I think people are a little bit slower to adopt because the change management around them or the lack of comfort around them is just high enough to slow it down. Yeah. And so I think as it is in any ecosystem, what I would say is the blended finance ecosystem as a whole is no different, which is people want to get a handle on it, they want to get comfortable with it, they want to decide when they step in first, second, third. And I think the same has existed with specific structures, and really trying to build confidence in those structures as they come. One great example, Ryan, actually, and for everybody, if you don't know it already, the Thrive Impact Fund, which is based in Victoria, BC, is an alt return fund that focuses on primarily investing in nonprofits, charities, co-ops, and some for-profit social enterprise. And they were one of the first funds in Canada to offer investors a selection of three rates of return. So if you wanted to invest as an LP in the fund, you can invest at 1%, 3%, or 8% because the fundamental structure is a loan fund, but they can do variations like revenue-backed financing, et cetera. And so it was one of the first funds in Canada to say, you pick your return. And there was a lot of socialization that needed to happen in the early days because it was just new for impact investors. And so getting comfortable with that. So I think always referring to first, if you can find examples and case studies in the Canadian context, that's maximum confidence. But then finding global context and really sharing how the de-risking of the structure, right, is occurring. So yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. Um, Perfect. So, um, so yeah, so just noting here, by the way, everybody, that Tasha popped into chat. Our speaker next week is going to be talking about global blended finance deal archetypes. It's actually very helpful and constructive for us in the Canadian context because it is a reminder that actually we're not alone in this, and B, that we can draw on some of these global archetypes to start to form the work that we want to do. So just noting that that's the case. So that's great. So thank you for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into my deck. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to start off with this notion of a portfolio approach to investing. And I think it's very important to share this. Interestingly enough, when I shared this a year ago, this, as it sits on the screen right now, is where the vast majority of impact investors and mainstream investors sat. And I think just in the midst of a lot of like economic uncertainty, a lot of global turmoil, people tend to go to what they are confident and comfortable in. And so historically, that would mean one of two things, either pure philanthropy or market rate returns only. So, for lack of a better term, there was a bit of a flight away from the middle. And so interestingly enough, I would say in the last 6 months in particular, at least in the context that I have through Spring and through our ecosystem, is that we're starting to see the missing middle return. And so, what is that missing middle? And so, first and foremost, what we're looking at is we're looking at this notion of how do we start to translate, from philanthropy to market rate returns. And so interestingly enough, we can start to think about this as a continuum, right? So impact motivated, impact committed, impact certified. Interesting taglines that this graphic speaks to. And so you can see on the left-hand side, it is market rate return centric, focus on financial return, desire for positive impact, and trying to be consistent with values. And then as we move through the continuum, then what you can see is that people are really starting to say, you know what, I am investing for impact. And I get so far as to say, hey, and we're going to be able to measure it. And and so now we live in this like really healthy tension, hopefully healthy tension between financial returns and impact returns. What I love to call ROI squared, right? Return on investment and return on impact. And so what that brings us to is it brings us to the full spectrum. And so it is important to note that we have the ability to maximize the attraction of impact with financial returns. We have the opportunity to blend attraction or blend impact with financial returns and then market rate returns. So often the reason we are all in this room is because we ask ourselves the question, okay, I believe now there is a full continuum. So the important part for all of us is there is no rule that says we have to play in any one column, right? And if we all think about it from our own personal investment activities, all of us take a portfolio approach to our own personal investing activities, right? We invest in RSPs in the Canadian context. We invest in real estate. We might invest in other public markets. Maybe we invest in a private organization. We do philanthropy, right? So the important part is we're trying to bring this into blended finance specifically. And what is exciting about this is it gives you an opportunity to start to build a portfolio approach to impact investing by hitting across all of these columns. And so the important part here is, and by the way, I just couldn't resist to put the heart in the middle. So thank you for letting me do that. But the important part is to really say, regardless of your respective thesis, there is an opportunity to find that balance between risk, return, and impact. So, for example, across this room, Ryan might have a risk, return, impact profile that looks a certain way and is defined in a specific way. Zara, especially with Makeway going through this strategic process, they're going to define or evolve their definition, and it will place them in a certain spot. And so the fun part is as each organization does that, what tends to happen is we start to see the overlap and the complementarity between organizations and between individuals, which allow us to co-invest in the right places at the right time. And so there is a thesis here that says all of us should be able to invest at all four of these points on the continuum according to how we define our risk, return, and impact. And so for everybody, that is our impact investing thesis. For some of you, you will have gone through so far as to A, define your impact investing thesis, and second, to also create a theory of change, either as an individual or with your organization. And so my encouragement to you is, if you have not done so already, that's okay. That's a part of the journey that we're all on. But if you have not yet defined either one or both, do know that in the online learning portal of the platform, and you would have all received an invitation to learn .spring.is. In the online portal, there's a section on building your impact investment thesis and on theory of change. And so my encouragement to you is to do that. Now, interestingly enough, when we last ran this program, we had one of Canada's largest credit unions in the room. And as they were sitting there, they actually kind of said, well, you know what? We actually haven't looked at this in a long time. And it actually triggered them organizationally to revisit and recast their theory of change. So the other thing that I would mention to everybody is, if it's been more than a year since you've looked at your theory of change, good time to shake the dust off of it and take a peek. It might be the same, but typically speaking, I find that it starts to evolve, it starts to hone, it starts to sharpen into focus. And so that would be my encouragement for you in this context. And so that's kind of where we're getting to as we start to think about, decluttering this like word soup and word cloud and really getting to where we need to go. So now let's take some of that word soup and word cloud and turn it into some specifics. So within philanthropy, and many of you have gone through this before, either as investors or investees, this is where we might have grants, design grants, technical assistance, grants, sometimes convertible grants, sometimes forgivable loans would be things that maybe are slightly more innovative and allow for funders and recipients to kind of find the right balance according to what we're trying to achieve. And then on this traditional market rate returns, classically loans and equity, right? And so the fun part now is, now that we're in this land where we're bringing back the middle, and this is where blended finance thrives, right? So loan guarantees, risk insurance, first loss capital that I mentioned before, sometimes below market rate loans, specifically defined as such, to be catalytic to bring in market rate capital alongside. Revenue-backed financing can really be on the spectrum from maximizing attraction all the way to market rate, convertible loans, recoverable grants, redeemable equity. Um, so those are some of the known vehicles that exist within blended finance to help fill this missing middle and to help us, best not only support amazing impact organizations, ventures, individuals, but also to, attract more capital, mainstream capital into impact, and for us to achieve our own risk return and impact objectives, right? And so we don't have to sacrifice those. We just know where we play in it. And we can do that on a macro basis with our investment thesis and theory of change, but we can therefore also take it down into each individual deal as they occur. So these are some of the key pieces that, we want to start with and say, okay, over the next 7 weeks as we go through this, we're going to actually dig into some very specific examples that cover some of these categories of blended finance, lessons learned, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what's worked in the global context, what's worked in the Canadian context, and more. So that's the intent that we go through. So I'm going to just give a few examples as we go through here. So if we think about traditional approaches like equity, debt, and the classic, let's call it market rate return, what are some of the things that we also can do? And what you'll notice is that on the bottom right-hand corner, for example, combining technical assistance with debt or equity to ensure that the organization has the capacity and the capability in order to either repay or deliver the returns as expected or promised. We can talk about guarantees, especially things like loan guarantees, first loss capital, subordinated debt, junior equity. Um, and these are different tools, just as examples, that really can help us think about situations where we may choose to participate. And when I say participate, I will note one additional thing, which is we can think about how we participate, um, which is either as leaders or followers in a deal, as we go through. So just noting that that's the case. Um, yeah. So Ajwa, thank you for mentioning, by the way, in the chat about revisiting theory of change. Um, Personally, I always recommend that organizations and or departments revisit their theory of change once a year. It's a great way to reground the team, of course, and align to 1 year goals, 3 year goals, 5 year goals. But the other thing too is it is a chance to catch where things might start to shift, especially, for example, in a fast changing world that we're in right now, and how we think about, the impact of global or political uncertainty, the impact of AI, right? These just things that can happen in the world, right? Whether it's in our community or macro. So just noting that. So thank you for that. Um, so one element that I wanted to share as an example of the evolution of approach, Ryan, refers back to the comment that you were asking earlier about the portability of concepts and structures into the Canadian ecosystem. And so in this particular case, in this particular example that I'm sharing, um, is actually an example that was documented in case study form by Roots of Impact, a global impact capital and capacity building organization. And this notion is what we call impact linked finance. And so the premise here is that um, the there is a financing structure that is put in place, and that the returns on that structure are variable according to the amount of impact that is measured. So if I use a simplistic example, let's say that we have a climate solutions company, and that climate solutions company puts forth that they have an ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and they can measure it. And so the premise would be, say, Sergio and I, as co-investors, we go in and we say, great, we will invest in this organization. and we're going to invest some financing. So let's call it revenue-backed financing and or debt. But if they hit their impact targets, we actually reduce the interest rate by a percentage. And if they exceed by a certain amount, we'll reduce it by even more. So that the premise here is that you have a base level of return, and that base level of return becomes variable according to the extent of impact that is achieved and measured. And so the first time that I personally saw this was actually in South Asia, and have since seen it in a few other contexts as well. Now, what I will note here is I have, in the Canadian context, seen a couple of people, like a couple of organizations, sorry to clarify, a couple of organizations start to look at the notion of doing impact-linked finance. But this is quite nascent in the Canadian context because I think the what has created friction, at least in the Canadian context, is a shared belief by the co-investors that they can actually measure the impact in order to validate the impact in order to then trigger the impact linked discounting. Um, so that's an example of this notion of leveraging a blended finance approach to fill this missing middle between philanthropy and market rate returns, um, and to create incentives that, depending on who our organization mandates on our own theory of change, where we can actually incentivize the organization to deliver and measure the impact that they believe that they're capable of doing. Um, I'm going to say a final thing about this one, and then I'm going to pause for questions on this. And that is, it may come as no surprise to everybody that often when you see an impact linked finance deal, you will also see some capacity building grant dollars come alongside, typically speaking, to help the organization to really articulate their impact thesis and what they can measure, and second, to help them actually set up those frameworks and processes internally to allow them to do it. Because often the organizations haven't yet set up the real rigor and structure around, measuring the impact in question. So I'm going to just pause here and see if there's any questions or comments on this particular component. Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, on the impact linked finance piece, would social impact bonds be an example of this? And I think of some of the ones that governments in Saskatchewan and Ontario and others have issued over the years, and it feels like they had a moment and are less common. But I'm just wondering if that's an example here.
Yeah, it's a great question. There definitely have been a couple of examples in the Canadian context of that. Yes. So that is a representative example of how you can do it. Now, what I would note here is the term impact linked finance, at least in the way that Roots of Impact defined it, was that it was like a financing vehicle, a loan-based vehicle. But to your point, within the concept framework, you're 100% correct that those types of bonds are representative examples of this type of approach. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and I mean, my sense is that they've become less. I don't know if they're less common. I think some of them were seen as rather controversial, but I don't know if that also reflects like trends in whether folks are leaning into this or, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to make an observation. I'd be curious for other people's perspectives on this. Definitely start to see momentum on this. As you said, there was a moment, like a few years where there was some traction. I think the impression that I have had over time is that two components impacted this. One is as we rolled through COVID, then economic uncertainty, then geopolitical uncertainty. Again, remember that kind of the flight to the edges, like pure philanthropy or market rate. And so I think there was you could see how capital providers were kind of looking, quote unquote, for safety, and so not an indictment per se of the vehicles, but more just a response to the macro factors by investors. However, I will make the side comment, and everybody, I'm going to say this with a big smile on my face. We're also very Canadian, right? And so historically, Canadian capital providers we've seen these moments where, let's call them evangelists or ambassadors of innovative models and approaches. They step out into the ecosystem And so typically speaking in the Canadian ecosystem is everybody leans in to look at it and then they stand back to see if it falls over. And then if it doesn't, then they kind of lean back in again. And that's, I'm saying with a big smile on my face because I'm born and raised Canadian. So I don't say, hi, my name is Keith. I say, sorry, my name is Keith, right? And so it is important to note that, all jokes aside, that is not uncommon in the Canadian context for different types of funding vehicles, especially in the world of impact investing. We saw that in the early days of revenue-backed financing. We saw it in the early days of redeemable share structures, impact guarantees would be loan guarantees, very hit and miss in the early days as well. So just noting in this particular case, when all of us collectively are stepping into structures and vehicles where we know they're going to be relatively new in the Canadian context, I find that the way that we can buffer the Canadian response, for lack of a better term, is early and often, right? Documenting the case studies, making sure that there's multiple co-investors at the table, so it's not just one organization bearing the risk, but also bearing the story, and then socializing that, in a way that gives people a comfort a little bit faster than they might normally take. And so yeah, so might be a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but there you go. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Fantastic. Any other comments or questions? Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share a quick case study on thinking about how we blend different types of capital together in a very different context, because I think it's important for us to recognize that the potential to use this is in many different cases. So what you're seeing on screen is an unmanned surface vehicle or an uncrewed vehicle from a company out of Victoria, British Columbia, which is called Open Ocean Robotics. And they are a technology company, hardware, software. And in their particular case, they started to grow quickly. Their technology is used for environmental monitoring, early detection of undersea earthquakes and tsunamis, monitoring and prevention of marine mammal strikes from the shipping industry, illegal fishing monitoring and enforcement. So there's a lot of scenarios upon which their technology can be used. They started to see their revenue go up. They saw an opportunity to bring in some growth funding, but they were kind of caught in the middle. And so what I mean by that is, first, it has a lot of hardware, as you can see. And typically, investors, especially in the earlier stages of an organization's life cycle, tend to be a little bit more risk averse around companies that require a lot of hardware, a lot of inventory, et cetera. Second, they had purchase orders, but the payments would come farther down the road. Um, and and so then the third component that came along with that was that they were doing a lot of research and development, but there's also like a delay through that process for R&D tax credits in Canada. And so interestingly enough, they had three potential pools of capital. They had investors, they had customers, and then they had the Canadian government. And so what actually happened in that context is they needed a way to bridge all of these things together. And so this is actually where Spring came into play. Now, in this particular case, it's Spring Activator. We invested off of our balance sheet. And what we did is we created a highly flexible loan, and that loan was linked to a combination of their R&D tax credits and their purchase orders. And the premise was to create cash flow abundance in the organization to allow them to bridge to early PO payment, allow them to bridge their R&D tax credit, and give them the spaciousness to then have the right conversations with the right investors, which, by the way, includes the Canadian government as grant investors, as well as angel investors and venture capital funds. So really, like a lot of players at the table. And so the way that we structured it was we created a very much a below market loan. It also was flexible on timing, so there was no set repayment date, and the repayment was only required on the back end. So there was no interim payments that were required. So maximum flexibility on time, duration, repayment method, and below market rate. And in addition to that, we also took 5% of this loan and we said, when you are ready to repay, we will actually convert 5% into an equity investment to act as the first check in their investment round. And so that's the process that we walk through in order to do that. So what we did is we put in the loan. By putting in the loan, that was the match funding requirement for them to get a federal Canadian grant. So that grant required a match capital. So that brought in the grant capital. And then once the two of us were there, she was able to attract investment that converted the spring investment, part of which was equity and that critical first check in a very risk-averse Canadian market. So that's an example of using a blended finance vehicle, which in this particular case was anchored with a below market rate loan with highly flexible terms, which allowed the organization to attract both grant capital as well as market rate return, angel investment, and venture capital. So that's just an example of how it rolled through. Ryan, over to you.
Hey, Keith, really appreciate this example. It came to mind because with our microloan, we've been trying to test out a way as we lend out to link it to more guaranteed funding. So, for example, we work with Job Skills, and they do like the Employment Ontario hiring grants. So we're trying to say to an entrepreneur, we would front you the money to hire the person, knowing that the grant is going to come in that would pay off the loan. But we're really struggling with how to structure it so that we know that grant coming in is tied to the loan that we're giving that they need to use for the wages. So, I mean, on a super small scale compared to this project, but just how to structure knowing that we're giving out the loan that a grant in the future is going to repay back. I don't know if there's any guidance, maybe not for now, but that was on my mind about how to tie it to a grant that would help reduce the risk of our loans going out.
Yeah, so for everybody, and by the way, there's again what Tasha was talking about earlier. There's a lot of experience in this room. So if any of you have perspectives on this, definitely now would be the time to share as well. Ryan, a few points of encouragement. So one is there actually are examples that exist in the ecosystem where there are certain pots of capital that are tied to grant capital and or like vice versa. One of the better examples that it would exist is National Research Council has a program which the acronym is IRAP. And so I'm going to pop this into chat. So NRC IRAP, they will provide grant capital to Canadian organizations under the premise that you have match, right? So often what you will hear, Ryan, and for other people here is you will sometimes hear a funder say, we provide funding on a match basis. And so NRC IRAP provides funding on a match basis, which means if they give you $100, you already have to have $100. And so this premise, Ryan, would be if this was NRC IRAP, you would literally be able to go to your investee and say, I'm going to give you $100. Now go call NRC IRAP and show them the $100. And then NRC IRAP would be like, great, you've got the match. Okay, like let's start the process. The key element for you though is the eligibility that they have for the grant and can you guarantee the grant on the back end? So there have been some situations where an organization says, I will partner with a granting organization. So in other words, Ryan, your organization would actually formally partner with the grant organization saying, if your team vets an applicant and they pass your applicant process, then they guarantee they get the grant on the back end. Right. So there have been a few instances of that. And so that's another way to consider it. So I think the big question for you, Ryan, really is how much do you need that grant to be guaranteed on the back end versus saying, here's the capital in a microloan structure. By the way, do yourself a favor and apply for this grant. You may get it. And I think that's really the key question here, because that would,
Yeah.
yeah. And it is important to note that I personally would argue that A, you might have a partner organization in place with that grant today. But the other thing too is in your approach, you also may find other people who are willing to come alongside to help backstop that, if not that
Okay.
granting organization. So just putting some early thoughts out there. Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that. We're definitely gonna dig in because yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody else has seen anything along those lines, like a direct link between like a microloan program or a capital program and a granting organization. Just putting out the offer there in case somebody has. Okay. It'll come up. When we have Claudia from Windmill Micro Lending, Ryan, I think you're going to hear some of that. So it's one of the reasons why I think she comes into the room in a couple of weeks. But I will also work with Tasha to dig up some very concrete examples because I think it would help you to just talk through it with a couple of people who have either done it or tried so that you can see the link. Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Zara, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. I'm finding it super helpful living vicariously through these case studies. Just wanted a point of clarification. So, um, when you said that Spring got 5% equity from the proceeds that, what did you mean by that? Like, what happened to the
Great question.
95%? And was that 5%, does that mean you're now like invested in this technology and are getting returns and dividends?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. So to clarify, in that particular context, so we provided a $600,000 loan below market rate. And so we provided that based on the parameters that I described earlier. So when they were ready to repay the $600,000, based on the agreement, what we did is we received $570,000 in payment plus interest, which was that below market rate interest. But 30,000 of the 600,000 we converted into equity in their organization. And so just so you know, as a percentage of ownership of the company, that's very small, right? Sub 1%. And so the reason we did that was twofold. One is as I said earlier, we wanted to, for lack of a better term, make the market for their equity round. So in other words, we wanted to say, we as Spring, we believe in this company, so we're investing for equity. So first step is we invested to make the market for the round to validate the round. The second reason we did it is because we actually did the math on the interest that we thought we might gain. And so the premise is we gave them 600. We wanted no more than 600 coming back to us. So in their particular case, at 570K plus interest, I think the repayment back to us was about 595,000, give or take. And so the benefit for them is they didn't need to draw any incremental capital out to us when they repaid. And so that meant that they were kind of whole on their money, on their cash, and then we made the round, like we set the validation of the round in order to do that. So to your point, now that we are part owners in that business, again, less than 1% of the company, that makes us eligible for future dividends and or if the company were to, go public or be acquired in the future, then we could benefit in that way. And so yeah. So and yeah, does that answer your question? It's a great question. Yeah. Great. Great. So just for everybody, always before we wrap, we want to just put a survey. We're always trying to make our programs better. So please, any and all feedback is welcome. Now, we just talked through this. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to just cover off a few more things. So just to note, this is the process that we are really driving forward in this program. But for some of you, it's kind of like going through the cycle maybe a second or a third time, and that is first, we want to make sure that you're all level set on, all aspects of blended finance, so that at the end of this program, you're like, great, I have confidence to start to dig deeper in a meaningful way. From there, and in parallel to what we're doing right now, you're building a community of fellow practitioners. Diana experienced that firsthand when she went to the Blended Finance 101 and the Blended Finance Summit. Ryan, you were also at the summit, which was fabulous. And so it is important to note that blended finance is best done in groups, right? It's best done in community. We're co-investing and collaborating together to bring these blended finance structures together. And so this is the starting point. Finding those people who their impact thesis and theory of change overlap with us such that we can do deals together. And also that people like Adjoa can look around and say, actually, I can see two organizations that overlap and I can talk to them together, right? So it plays well for both funder and investee alike. The third step is to follow a deal. Now, we've been sharing some case studies here, but what I would encourage is as you're starting to prepare to do these deals, there is opportunities on a regular basis, literally daily in the Canadian ecosystem now, where you can shadow deals that are happening so you can see them unfold. This, I find, has the greatest impact on the cost of you doing your first deal, specifically legal costs as well as time, because you start to gain confidence in the structures. You start to know, even as simple as who are the lawyers who have done this type of deal before. That can really save a lot of time and money and efficiency, which means more capital can go into the organization in question. And then, of course, from there, we start to build portfolio. Now, with that in mind, these are two questions that I just want you to start to think about as we're moving through, because in each subsequent week, you're going to have an opportunity to start to dig into these elements and think about what are the burning questions that you have, especially at the end of our talks, panels, case study examples, etc. So really starting to bring those to life. So hold on to these questions, surface them on a regular basis. Tasha and I will be probing as well to make sure that you're, really, able to explore these effectively. Now, as we're moving towards wrap, a couple of things. Arguably, these are the two biggest thought leaders in blended finance globally. Ani Patton-Power is an Oxford professor. She is an author. She wrote a book called Adventure Finance. She launched the Innovative Finance Initiative. She runs actually two incredible impact investing courses at Oxford each year. They just don't do them enough. I will say, like, it'd be great if she did them every semester, but it's kind of like every year and a half or so. So, but I will note that there's tremendous opportunity there. And then Jed Emerson, arguably kind of the godfather of blended finance as an ecosystem, has written several books on the topic, and has really been a thought leader in blended finance for over 30 years. So just as you're thinking about people to follow, and Ani's fabulous, she puts out a lot of great content, and part of where she does that is here. So the Innovative Finance Initiative is the global context for blended finance. And so this is just a screenshot of the website. But my encouragement to you is, as you start to go down this journey, Innovative Finance Initiative is a place where you can find case studies, examples, resources, templates, events. Remember always that this is full global context. So you will find things from the UK, you'll find things from Africa, from Cambodia, from the US, right? Like, so from all over the place. Great inspiration, great examples, a great framework to do that. This is the Canadian Blended Finance Resource Hub. This is where you are going to find everything that is happening and or is emerging specifically in the Canadian context. So Ryan, in your case, I can envision how you could start with the Innovative Finance Initiative to see global examples of what you were asking about. And then you would come in here and you could say, okay, so who's doing it exactly in Canada, right? So this is a great example of that. And we'll make sure that you have the links. The links are in the resources section of the online learning portal. To trust that they're there along with several others, which is great. To to give you an example, there's 6 case studies that are currently in the Blended Finance, Canadian Blended Finance Hub. But just note that there's actually several more that are about to get published, including several of the ones that were actually presented at the Blended Finance Summit. So this is constantly being added. And so great examples here at the grant level, at the loan level, and using other types of vehicles. And then I'm just going to go to the week ahead and then we're going to wrap. So introduce yourself in Impact Springboard, which is our Slack group. In addition to that, there are 2 short reads that I highly recommend. One is Innovative Finance 101. The second one is the Short Guide to Impact Investing. Both of those are in the first section of the online learning portal. So just go in there. They're right there. Great 5-minute read with your favorite kombucha, Amaro cocktail. You take your pick. And then just start to think a little bit about these questions. And in particular, what we always find is we get to this point, people not only think about their organizational thesis and theory of change, but they also start to bring up their personal one. So please do dig on that. Again, the resources are in the hub. And if you are working on it, either organizationally or personally, then message myself and Tasha, like DM us in Slack, share it. Gladly give you feedback, gladly set up a meeting to talk about it, brainstorm through it. We love doing that with participants in the program. This is a roster of upcoming events. We will share this list with you. These are global events that are happening. If I wanted to give you all a highlight event, that would be the Catapult Future Fest, which you will find at the end of May at the bottom of the screen. And some of the biggest brains, biggest change makers in the world descend on that conference. So if time and budget allows, highly recommended. We'll share a link to that. And then just as a reminder, next week, blended approaches and structures. And so in that particular session, we're actually we called it International Week. So the premise is that it's going to come back. It's going to come from out. So we're actually going to talk about these archetypes on a global stage, an opportunity to kind of really dig in and see macro what's happening in the blended finance ecosystem and start to bring some of these concepts that to life that we've been sharing so far. So I'm going to pause here. I apologize for being 4 minutes late, but I do want to just create a moment of space here if anybody has any questions or comments or feedback. Amazing. You guys are too kind. It's been absolutely fantastic to share this space and this journey. And again, the poll is up on screen just one last time in case you missed it. But please do engage Impact Springboard, say hi. If you want to start to talk impact thesis, impact theory of change, please don't hesitate to share it with us, ask questions. And next week, we're going to have International Week, so we're looking forward to it. Amazing. Okay. Thank you all. Speak soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great one.
You
Later.
too.